Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Financial Advisors Workshop. This is the show where we meet the top financial advisors in America and hear how they do their practice, how they run their business, and how they had success. So today we have Matt Miller, and Matt has an interesting background, and he now runs a firm called Uplink, but quite a story. So Matt, welcome to the Financial Advisors Workshop.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's a pleasure. It is Upleft, just for the record.
So Upleft,
Correct.
and we'll hear about. So, well, why don't we just talk about that? Why do you
Sure.
call it?
Well, there are three sort of definitions. The simplest, which is, and a lot of people make this mistake, they confuse it for the word uplift, which is sort of part of our mission. If you think that at our very core, what we're trying to do is uplift people and families and communities through our work. But the twist on that being upleft is if you were to look at the map of the continental United States, I'm about as far up and to the left as you could possibly be. So I joke with folks that it's directions to the office. We are in Washington State on the Olympic Peninsula, which is about 2.5 hours west of Seattle. So if I were to go about 2 blocks north, I'm standing in the water between the US and Canada. And if I'm to go a few miles west, I'm standing in the Pacific. The other one is extraordinarily nerdy, but since we're talking to industry folks, the upper left-hand corner is the part of the efficient frontier, of course, with the lowest risk and the highest return.
Okay, that's
Just
right.
what we all shoot for.
Up and to the left. I got it.
Up and to the left.
Wonderful. Well, good. So, all right. So that's kind of the thought process there. Matt, you've had a really interesting career, and why don't you start where you began, and then we'll go all the way through your Buddhist monk era. We have a lot of things to talk about.
It has been a long, strange trip. Unlike a lot of folks that I come across in the industry, I'm a little bit of an oddball in that when I was 16, 17 years old, I pretty much knew this is what I wanted to do. I pursued a finance degree. I've always been sort of quantitative in nature. I got out of college and realized that a lot of people aren't probably going to rush to trust a 22-year-old with their life savings. So I got into some corporate finance, working for a big sort of Fortune 100 company. And that's what I did for my first few years out of school. One of the things that really brought me back around, it's not the big thing that brought me back around to my original mission of serving families, was when my dad passed away. I was about 5 years out of college. So I was 27 years old. My mom was about 57, so a pretty young widow. And she was suddenly left, like a lot of folks are, with a bunch of accounts and retirement statements and things that she never really had to deal with before. I was not in the private client world then, so I was fortunate enough to be able to call a friend who flew in from the Midwest, met with mom for the very first time, and an hour later, seeing the relief on her face, seeing her get out of a chair and hug a complete stranger, which is not something my mother is likely to do very often. Really, it was a wake-up call. And it reminded me of, candidly, how little satisfaction there was in helping a multi-billion-dollar corporation make a few more dollars. It wasn't too long after that I knocked on the door of my local office of that same firm, that same Midwestern firm my friend worked for. I don't mind sharing that. That was A.G. Edwards. They're not in business anymore. And I candidly just went in there with my favorite suit. I asked to speak with the manager and said, I'd like to work here. What do I have to do? And that was sort of the beginning of my private client career.
So you're at A.G. Edwards. Tell us about that. And then what does that evolve to?
So A.G. Edwards was, like I said, they're out of St. Louis. They were a firm that, as far as I'm concerned, really did things the right way. They very much embedded in the entire culture that the end client comes first. They are just about the only priority. The advisor stands behind them. And then this enormous organization all stood behind the advisor in support of that client. And they lived it. When you went to St. Louis and to the head office, every employee, including the people that worked in the cafeteria, really seemed to understand that's why this place was built. The mid-2000s were a crazy time in our industry. You probably remember. Through a whole lot of mergers and acquisitions. I joke with people, but I was serious. I worked for 3 or 4 different companies. I never changed desks because companies just kept merging and buying one another.
Around you.
Fast forward a few years, I'm working for a major bank, which is not what I signed up for. a corporation where suddenly that commitment to the client didn't seem as fiercely defended. I felt like the pressure to perform for, of course, the shareholders of the corporation and for all the levels of middle management sort of usurped that prime directive of do everything you can for the client. And it was little things like little rinky-dink fees that they never had to face before, or the flexibility I used to have to do things like, give my mom a discount, things like this. So suddenly the work became less satisfying. Bluntly, my own compensation led my personal life to become much more of a struggle. A.G. Edwards payouts to advisors were probably 40% higher than what I was getting by the time I left that big bank company. So after 2007, 2008, 2009, I wouldn't have felt right sort of leaving people in the lurch. So after getting people through the worst of that Great Recession, for my own reasons, whether that be my own personal finances or just the frustration I was feeling working for this kind of company, I got more into the institutional side of the business and relocated out to Colorado. And that, I worked for a couple of companies in the institutional space, which gave me exposure to parts of the business I never really knew existed, including really getting to know what it's like in the RIA channel. Over the years, some of those big broker-dealer firms have introduced ways to sort of retain their advisors by having pseudo-independent business models. And they really tried to shelter their rank and file people from other ways of doing business for their own purposes, of course. So seeing that there were folks out there who could sort of operate by their own North Star, so to speak, and do what they think is right all of the time without having to negotiate that with the best interests of the board of directors or what have you, really woke me up to this idea that maybe the industry, maybe I'd overcorrected in my cynicism that was from that bank experience, and realized there was a way to do what I wanted to do in a way that didn't conflict with what I feel was right. Mm-hmm. You mentioned something in the question, and that was that sort of in the middle there somewhere, I did take a bit of a hiatus to realize what I could honestly refer to as a lifelong ambition of mine. I was ordained as a Buddhist monk in a small monastery in the south of Thailand in a very rural area. And that was something that it would be hard for that not to change a person. Mm-hmm. I don't really put it front and center. I mean, you don't see references to any deep philosophy or religion or anything like that in the work that I do. But at the core of that time was this notion that to be humble, to let go of sort of your own vanity and literally your material possessions, but probably most importantly, to say that your purpose for getting up in the morning is to be of service. Right. And like I said, it was a very rural community. I mean, I saw people living in structures where folks I grew up around in farm towns wouldn't have kept their livestock or their hay bales in these shacks. And it really does change the way you look at the world to say, I wake up every morning and I'm in service to these people, doing whatever you can, whether that be helping them find food or literally one day cleaning the bird poop off a local building. It is humbling, but it changes the way you look at the concept of service, which is something I really try to put at the core of what I do now.
So you think doing the Buddhist monk training helped you in service?
I do. It's a strange thing because this was in Thailand, like I said, and in Thai society, everyone realistically, it's a Buddhist nation. They elevate in their culture the position of a monk, and it's sort of counterintuitive because if you go wait at the airport for a flight, there's a special like monk seat. There's pregnant ladies, old people, and monks. People that get like special seating. And there's reasons for that, but the the dichotomy of this idea that when you become a monk, you say to yourself, I am putting everyone around me above me. I am in service to the lowest of people. And then the irony of the fact that those very same people are sort of lifting you up at the same time. It's oddly beautiful, but yeah, it's a philosophy that I think is at the core of what I do. And again, I don't talk about this a lot in my work. I don't think I have to. I think the work sort of speaks for itself. But I feel that if I do what I can to be of service to the people that trust us, I don't need to be a big self-promoter. I don't need to be flashy. My work and the people that receive my service have a way of lifting me up on their own. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, Matt. And in fact, we talked before about your feeling and your concern about how our industry often speaks in jargon, and we're not really doing things sometimes. There are certain people for the good of the client. They're doing, to sound smart or to be important or whatever. What was your thought on that? And how do you think the Buddhist monk training kind of helped you with that view?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and it does tie in because I'll just say it. There's a lot of gigantic egos in our industry. In a lot of ways, our industry has been built on giant egos.
Yeah.
And this idea that, I'll give you a little bit more detail in the process of ordination. Needless to say, they shave your head. In Thailand, only they shave your eyebrows off. This is essentially to reduce this idea of your personal physical vanity. You don't have any belongings. They even change your name, so your name is taken away from you to a certain extent. So this is the opposite of ego, realistically. And so when I go into an advisor shop and I notice, I look at 4-star, for instance, is a great example. In my own, world, Upleft is an example. Much to my mom's dismay, I did not name the place Matt Miller Financial or anything like that, because I see it all the time. And folks build these like little temples to their own importance. And you walk into their office and you're surrounded by their certificates and diplomas and things, and their name is splashed on everything from the wall outside to the pen you're holding. And it sends, I think, a message, whether on purpose or not, to the client that's sitting in the room talking to you. And that is, you're never going to be the most important in this room, most important person in this room, because that's the guy whose name is all over everything. So to be humble and to put that ego aside is the first step in letting a client understand, performing to our fiduciary duty, and that concept earlier of putting clients at the top of a priority list. I think the first step in that is letting them understand that they are the most important person in every conversation that happens at that office. Mm-hmm. That's a very hard thing to do while simultaneously hitting them over the head with how important you think you are. Mm-hmm. Forgive me if I seem a little judgmental when I say that, but maybe I am.
No, well, it just shows your background and where you've been and your view of how to serve clients. So, well, good. And now you're a CFP as well, and you've got all those titles and letters and all that.
Yeah.
So tell us about how you serve clients. Like, you've been obviously around the industry quite a bit now, and in and out in different ways. How do you serve clients?
So, once again, I'll lean back on this idea that the core is, one, making it about them, and two, something you mentioned earlier, is trying to take away that intimidation factor. I don't sit behind a big oak desk that separates me from them. My conference room looks a little bit like a living room. It's got a couch and a coffee table and a little fireplace. So there's no physical barrier between me and the client. There's just a little bit of space for them to say what they have to say. Okay. I keep my book of business intentionally restricted on the number of people that I'm willing to work with sort of personally. I've got a couple other advisors that have come on more recently that are slowly building their books of business. But as far as me being sort of the lead for a relationship, I told myself when I opened the doors, that 60 was going to be my limit, and I haven't hit that yet. So I've got room for a few more. But the reason I do that is, so for instance, right now, let's say I'm somewhere around 50 households I work with.
Okay.
If I take a couple weeks off a year, in theory, I could commit 1 week to every single household I work with, which means if they come in with an issue and I have to drop everything and spend an hour and a half talking to them, I can do it. And they feel that difference when the responses are very quick. And when I take the time to really understand the problem, as opposed to just trying to rush to a solution, I think that matters. So going back to your question, from the very first time somebody comes into the office, you may have gathered by now, as I mentioned to you before our interview, brevity is not exactly my strong suit. So I pad my schedule and I say, you know what, for your discovery meeting, let's just assume it's going to take 90 minutes.
Great.
But the interesting thing is, when folks come in, I start asking them about their lives. I ask them about their families, their occupations, what they do for fun. I get a sense of who this person is as a human and what their priorities are. And a funny thing happens more often than not. After about, let's call it 45 minutes or so, they start to wonder, and you can see it. When is this guy going to ask me about the money?
Right.
So sometimes they bring like a great big folder or an envelope full of statements and things with them, and you see them start sort of fidgeting with the papers. And I'm not for everybody. I'll be the first person to admit it. But by the time I ask them about the assets, about the nuts and bolts of it all, two weird things happen. One of which is we really feel like we know each other better, which is a different experience for them than most folks they've talked to in finance. Right. And the other one is, and this is not on purpose, but it's just true, I feel like there's a strange sense of relief when we start talking about the money, because that was the conversation they were probably expecting when they came in.
Right.
But now it just feels different. It doesn't feel quite as invasive. It doesn't feel like a stranger asking you to share some things that for a lot of generations are considered to be sort of not to be spoken about, or at the very least, quite personal. So that's sort of the experience on the front end. I consider myself to be a pretty deep planner. It's one of those things where if we don't help people focus on goals or specific targets, people will make up their own targets. And sometimes those measuring sticks are terrible. A person with a 30% equity allocation will start comparing themselves against the S&P 500. Well, that's just silly. I mean, or worse yet, the guy in their golf foursome that's lying about how well he's doing, that's not your benchmark. You don't need to beat that guy. Maybe you need to beat him on the golf course, but you don't need to beat him on your statements. So helping people keep that focus on what's really important to them. And I guess the last critical component of the service model is something that's hard to quantify, is especially in times like right now, where, the markets can drop 2.5 points in a given day, or they can run up 2.5 points in a given day. And our job is to help people make the best decision they can when it's the hardest to make that best decision. And what that usually means is when they're a little too excited, we have to say, yeah, things are great and we'll take what we can get from these markets. But let's not forget, it's not always going to be this way. And let's temper our expectations a little. And when things look terrible, our job is to say, hey, things look bad right now. It's not always going to be this way.
Right.
Let's remember, you get what I'm saying. So to keep people, and not to lean on it too much, but that those probably go back to some of the training and sort of general philosophy of keeping that perspective and being able to remain sort of placid when things are way too exciting.
Exactly. Things get crazy. You got to keep your head about you.
Amen.
Yes. Good. All right. Well, good. So, what do you think of what's going on in the financial markets right now? And how are you communicating that to clients? Because things are really a little crazy right now. We've got an election coming up, as you say, and a lot of different things. What is your message at this point for clients?
It's funny. As you might guess, I don't get too heavy into sort of the market prediction quant side of things in my ordinary conversations with clients. I believe that what we do is primarily about human behavior, which is a weird thing for me to say because the reason I got into this industry quite young, and the reason I studied finance, is because I was fascinated and borderline obsessed with the quantitative side of things. I was always sort of good at math, so that's the direction I led in. The interesting thing is now the quant side is a minority piece of what I worry about on the day-to-day. I worry about people. Now that said, I do a little bit of writing, and I also, as part of that, put out a newsletter to clients a handful of times a year. And usually like 1/3 of that newsletter has to do with sort of perspective when it comes to markets and market conditions. And interestingly, while I ordinarily would not have a quick answer to your question, when you talk specifically about the election, that is something I addressed in my most recent one. The short version is this. In election years, historically speaking, they've generally been positive. The interesting thing is they've been positive to the tune of 11 or 12%. We've already overshot that year to date in, let's call it the S&P. So if there was a reversion to the mean, that would actually mean we would have a few percent loss between now and the end of the year.
Right.
That said, I don't make short-term predictions. I feel like that's sort of a fool's errand. If you needed money between now and the end of the year, there's no reason it should be in the stock market in the first place.
Right.
But that said, the one thing I am willing to predict, and so far I've been right about it, is the kind of volatility we would see in September and October of an election year. And that's already started to come true.
Right.
So, I mean, something I say to people all the time is, the time to put your seatbelt on is before you started the car.
Right.
If you're in a situation now where the market does a somersault and you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? Your advisor's answer should be, oh, we've already done it. Because now it's too late. I mean, this is what planning is, right? Matching up the proper timeline with the proper implementation.
Way ahead of you. Way ahead of you.
I would imagine so.
That's right. That's the way to play it. Yeah, that's the way to play it. Well, good. So you had ended up in Forbes magazine and a couple of other high-profile magazines. How did that happen?
Like I said, I do a little bit of writing, and gosh, this is going back years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. I'm going to ballpark it. I wrote essentially a guide for, I think it was the one for new parents, and somebody in U.S. News and World Report picked up this guide and reached out and said, hey, I'm writing a piece on financial advice for new parents. Do you mind if I take a few lines from what you put together here and include it in this article? I said, yeah, of course. I could use the recognition. Why not? And that sort of took on a little bit of a life of its own insofar as, I guess, once you become known as a person that can offer the occasional line or two of context around a story someone's trying to write, the world of financial journalism, I guess, is pretty small. So somebody reach out to me again, sometimes a few months, sometimes a couple years later, and say, hey, got any opinions on this? And the answer is yes. I think the one in Forbes, which is interesting because of the places I've been quoted, that's probably the biggest name, so to speak. It was sort of the borrow and die, for lack of a better description, tactic of avoiding taxation or minimizing taxation would be the more appropriate way to say it. So, borrowing against heavily appreciated assets and letting them receive a step up on cost basis when a person dies. It's far away from the stuff I usually write about. It's very technical in nature, but at the same time, I think it just happened to be at a time when a lot of people were paying attention to like the Bezoses of the world, taking advantage of some of these tricks. And I happen to know how to do it. So it's another thing that got a little bit of press.
Nice. Well, good. So it's good to hear your ideas. Good to hear where you're going with your business. What do you see in our industry changing? You've got some pretty interesting opinions about how people treat clients and such. Do you see any changes coming up for the industry?
I wish I was more optimistic, candidly. Those great big monsters that gobble up other banks and brokerage firms, they're not getting smaller, and they've got all the lobbying power in the world. I'll give you an example. Just in the last few years, how many times has the fiduciary standard been put on and taken back off the table again by our legislators. This very basic idea, which is, hey, if we're in this line of work, shouldn't we care more about what's good for the client than anything else? And yet there are gigantic corporations out there, several of them, that put millions and millions of dollars into this idea of, no, we don't want that. And sadly, the elected officials who receive their donations tend to agree with them. So as far as the industry concerns, I think folks like you and I, people in the RIA space, I candidly, I don't know. As you mentioned earlier, I'm a CFP. So between being an RIA and having a CFP, I am sort of twice bound to the fiduciary standard.
Right.
I think folks like us are going to continue to fight an uphill battle. But, we, at the risk of being overly dramatic, we save who we can. Every time I pull someone away from one of these companies who clearly isn't putting their needs first, who's either overcharging them and or being really opaque about how they're paying for their services.
Right.
That's a win, not just for the client and not just for the company, but for the right way to do things.
Right.
So my personal goal, I mentioned there's a couple of gentlemen here who are working with me who are IARs, who are trying to build their practice. And, I've gotten to a place, like I said, if I put my ceiling at 60 and I'm already at around 50 or a little better of households I work with, my next best thing I could do for the greater good is to teach other people how to do what we do in the way that I think is right, and help build a little army of folks who are willing to push back against that tide of these great big corporations that I think maybe aren't doing things the right way. But I don't see the battle lines moving very much, but we have to do what we can, right?
Right. Exactly. That's great. Well, good. Well, you got a great story, and I love the Buddhist monk twist to this, and it shows in your heart and how you treat people and how you represent our industry. So it's actually very impressive. And thank you for all that. Thanks for sharing your story with us, and thanks for being with us today on the Financial Advisor Workshop.
Thank you for the opportunity to share. I genuinely hope some people can learn some things, and maybe we can help together make us all do a little better work.
That'd be great. Well, good. Well, we're lucky to have you here, and we are interviewing folks all over the country, and you're a very unique one. We do hear a lot of very unique stories, and just as unique as all the people out there. So, Matt, thanks again for being with us. I think we'll leave it there.
Thank you, Brian.
All right. And thanks everybody for being with us today. We'll be back again with another episode of the Financial Advisors Workshop. Until then, over and out. Thanks, everybody.